Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: The Whispering Lake. The air was damp with a heavy scent of moss and decaying wood, the kind of smell that clings to you long after you've left the forest. The narrow dirt path wound through towering pines, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands toward the darkening sky. Erin's boots crunched against the uneven ground as she followed her friends deeper into the woods, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and flicker with unnatural life. The lake was supposed to be just ahead, a hidden gem nestled in the heart of the forest. They had heard stories about it growing up, how it was impossibly still, how the water seemed darker than the night itself. But it was the whispers that fascinated them most, the tales of voices calling to people from beneath the surface, luring them into the depths. It was just an urban legend, Erin reminded herself, but even so, a chill crept up her spine as they walked. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jake called from the back of the group, his flashlight beam darting nervously between the trees. His voice sounded too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. Erin glanced over her shoulder and nodded. "The old map said the trail should lead straight to it," she replied, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The map they'd found online had been grainy and poorly scanned, a relic from decades ago, but it was the only guide they had. Jake muttered something under his breath and quickened his pace to keep up with the others. Beside Erin, Sam grinned, his usual bravado unshaken. "Relax, man," he said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "What's the worst that could happen? We get lost and have to camp out here for the night? Sounds like an adventure to me." The group of 5 pressed on, the forest growing darker and more suffocating with each step. The trees seemed to crowd closer together, their branches knitting into a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Erin's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the shadows around them seemed to ripple as if alive. She shook the flashlight, her heart racing, and the beam steadied. "This place is creepy as hell," Rachel muttered, breaking the silence. Her usually sharp tone was softer now, edged with unease. "Why would anyone come out here willingly?" Sam laughed, but it sounded forced. "Because we're idiots with nothing better to do on a Friday night," he said, but no one joined in. When they finally emerged from the trees, the sight before them stole the breath from Erin's lungs. The lake stretched out like a black mirror, perfectly still and reflecting the darkened sky above. It was larger than she had expected, its edges disappearing into the mist that clung to the surface like a shroud. The air was colder here, biting against her skin despite the mild autumn evening. The group stood in silence, staring at the water as if it had some magnetic pull. Erin shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Well, we found it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now what?" Jake glanced around nervously, his eyes darting to the water and back. "We take a look, maybe snap a few pictures, and then get the hell out of here," he said. "This place gives me the creeps." Sam, of course, had other ideas. "Come on," he said, already heading toward the narrow strip of beach at the water's edge. "We didn't come all this way just to turn around and leave. Let's check it out." Erin hesitated, her gut telling her to turn back, but she didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip. She followed Sam, the others trailing behind her reluctantly. As they reached the shoreline, the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the unnatural stillness of the lake. The water was so dark that Erin couldn't see her reflection, only an endless void that seemed to stretch down forever. She had the strange sensation that it was looking back at her, waiting. Sam picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the water. It hit the surface with a soft plunk, the ripples spreading out in perfect circles before disappearing entirely. "See," he said, turning back to the group with a grin. "Nothing to be scared of. Just a regular old lake." But as the ripples faded, Erin thought she heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the water itself. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others exchanged uneasy glances. "Hear what?" Rachel asked, but Erin didn't answer. She was staring at the water, where the ripples had been moments before. For a split second, she thought she saw something beneath the surface. A pale, shifting shape that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The unease among the group grew as the night wore on. Sam tried to lighten the mood by joking around, but even he seemed more subdued. They built a small fire on the beach, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Erin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she looked over her shoulder, the forest behind them was empty. The whispers started again as the fire burned low, faint and fleeting, as if carried on the wind. Erin wasn't the only one who heard them this time. Rachel sat bolt upright, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Jake shook his head, his grip on the flashlight tightening. "Probably just the wind," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Erin stared at the lake, her pulse pounding in her ears. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, though the words were impossible to make out. She thought she saw movement again, just beneath the surface. A pale hand, its fingers splayed, reaching upward. She blinked, and it was gone. "We need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "Now." Sam opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, a splash echoed across the lake. It was loud and sudden, breaking the unnatural stillness like a gunshot. The group froze, their eyes locked on the water. The ripples spread outward, and for a moment, the lake seemed alive, its surface shifting and heaving. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The lake was still once more, but the whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, more urgent, until they seemed to surround the group, coming from all directions. Jake was the first to panic. He grabbed his backpack and started toward the forest, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. "Screw this," he said, his voice high-pitched with fear. "I'm not staying here another second." The others hesitated, but Erin didn't blame him. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to get as far away from the lake as possible. But as Jake reached the edge of the trees, something stopped him. He froze mid-step, his body rigid. "Jake?" Rachel called, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Erin shone her flashlight on him, and her stomach dropped. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on something in the trees. "Jake, what is it?" Sam asked, moving toward him. Before anyone could react, Jake let out a strangled scream and bolted into the forest. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the trees. "Jake, wait!" Rachel shouted, running after him. Sam and Erin followed, the darkness of the forest closing in around them. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and clearer, though the words still eluded them. Erin's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light on the gnarled trunks and tangled undergrowth. "Jake," she shouted, but there was no response. The forest seemed endless, the path disappearing beneath their feet. They found Jake a few minutes later, or what was left of him. He was lying on the ground, his body contorted in an unnatural position. His face was frozen in a rictus of fear, his eyes staring blankly at the canopy above. Rachel screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Sam backed away, his face pale. "What the hell happened to him?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Erin crouched beside Jake, her stomach churning. There were no wounds, no sign of an attack, but his skin was ice cold, as if he had been dead for hours. "We need to leave," she said again, her voice trembling. "No." As they stumbled back toward the lake, Erin realized the whispers had stopped. The silence was even worse. It was heavy and suffocating, pressing down on her like a weight. The lake came into view, its surface unnaturally still. The fire they had built was out, the ashes scattered as if by unseen hands. Rachel sobbed quietly, her hands trembling as she clung to Sam. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Erin didn't have an answer. She only knew that the lake wanted them there, that it wasn't going to let them go. As they stood on the shore, the water began to ripple. A single figure rose from the depths, pale and translucent, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It raised an arm, pointing at Erin, and she felt a cold hand grip her heart. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure's face, hollow and twisted, its mouth moving in a silent scream. Here's an expanded and more descriptive continuation of the story, amplifying the horror and building on the existing atmosphere. The figure rose higher from the lake's surface, its body translucent and unnaturally long. Water dripped from its form in slow, deliberate rivulets that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, glistening like black ichor in the pale moonlight. Its face was a grotesque parody of humanity, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth, and skin that rippled as if something writhed just beneath its surface. The whispers started again, louder this time, an incomprehensible symphony of voices that made Erin's ears ache. They weren't just sounds, they were inside her head, prying at her thoughts, twisting her memories. She clutched her temples and sank to her knees, the flashlight falling from her hand and casting wild, erratic beams across the shoreline. Rachel was sobbing uncontrollably now, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped her phone into the sand. Sam, usually the bravest of the group, stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "We have to run," Erin screamed, though her voice barely rose above the cacophony of whispers. Her words seemed to jar Sam back into motion, and he grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the forest. But as they turned, the figure moved. It didn't walk or swim. It simply glided across the surface of the lake, its elongated limbs bending at impossible angles as it reached out for them. Erin scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving as she tried to focus on the path. The forest that had been so dense earlier now seemed endless, the trees stretching impossibly high and their trunks twisting as if alive. The ground beneath her feet was soft and spongy, sucking at her boots with every step. The air grew colder with each passing second, so cold that her breath came out in visible puffs, mingling with the mist that clung to the ground. Somewhere behind her, she heard Rachel scream, a sound so raw and primal that it made Erin's blood run cold. She didn't dare look back. The whispers followed them into the forest, echoing from every direction. They weren't just words anymore. They were voices Erin recognized. Her mother's soothing lullabies, Jake's laugh from earlier that evening, even her own voice calling out her name. "Erin," it whispered, soft and seductive, "come back. You're safe here." She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and fell hard onto her hands and knees. The earth was wet and sticky, and when she looked down, she realized it wasn't dirt but some kind of viscous black liquid that clung to her skin and clothes. It reeked of rot, the stench so overpowering that she gagged. Sam and Rachel were ahead of her now, their figures barely visible through the thickening fog. "Wait," she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the forest. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks contorted and oozing with the same black liquid that coated the ground. Erin pushed herself up, her legs trembling as she forced herself to move. The whispers were louder than ever, an endless chorus that seemed to mock her every step. She could feel something behind her, a cold presence that pressed against her back like a physical weight. When she finally caught up to Sam and Rachel, they were standing at the edge of a clearing, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Erin followed their gaze and felt her stomach drop. The lake was there, impossibly close, even though they had run in the opposite direction. Its surface was no longer still. It churned and bubbled as if something massive was moving beneath it. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, an oppressive force that made the air feel too thick to breathe. "This isn't possible," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "We were running away from it. How did we—" Her words were cut off as the ground beneath them began to shift. It wasn't an earthquake, but something far worse. The earth pulsed, rising and falling like a living, breathing thing. Roots tore through the ground, writhing and snapping like serpents. One of them wrapped around Rachel's ankle, yanking her off her feet. She screamed, clawing at the ground as it dragged her toward the lake. Sam lunged for her, grabbing her arms and pulling with all his strength, but the roots were too strong. They twisted and coiled around her legs, pulling her closer to the water. "Help me!" Rachel screamed, her voice raw with terror. Erin ran to her side, grabbing her other arm, but the roots didn't relent. The whispers grew deafening, and Erin could see shapes moving beneath the surface of the lake. Dozens of pale, twisted figures, their faces distorted with agony. One by one, they began to rise, their hands reaching out toward Rachel as the roots dragged her into the water. Erin and Sam pulled with everything they had, but it was no use. Rachel's screams turned into gurgles as the lake swallowed her whole, the water closing over her head with a sickening finality. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of Erin's ragged breathing and Sam's quiet sobs. The lake was still again, as if nothing had happened, but Erin knew better. The figures were still there, just beneath the surface, watching and waiting. "We have to go," Sam said, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here now." Erin nodded, too numb to argue. They turned and ran, the forest seeming to shift and twist around them with every step. The path was gone, replaced by endless trees that all looked the same. Erin's legs burned, her lungs screaming for air, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The whispers returned, softer this time, but more insidious. They no longer called her name but instead spoke of her deepest fears and regrets, dredging up memories she had long buried. "You left her," one voice whispered, dripping with malice. "You let her die." Erin clenched her fists, tears streaming down her face as she ran. "Shut up," she muttered, her voice trembling. "Just shut up." The trees finally broke, and Erin and Sam stumbled into another clearing. But instead of relief, a fresh wave of terror washed over her. They were back at the lake. The fire they had built earlier was burning again, the flames impossibly tall and casting eerie shadows across the water. And there, standing at the edge of the lake, was Rachel. Her clothes were soaked, her hair plastered to her face, and her skin was impossibly pale. She turned to look at them, her eyes hollow and black, a smile stretching across her lips. "You shouldn't have run," she said, her voice layered with other voices, a chilling harmony that made Erin's blood turn to ice. The water behind Rachel began to churn, and more figures started to rise, their faces blank and featureless. Erin took a step back, her legs trembling, but the ground beneath her shifted again, roots snaking up to wrap around her ankles. She screamed, struggling against them, but the roots only tightened their grip. Sam reached for her, but before he could pull her free, the whispers surged again, louder than ever, drowning out everything else. The last thing Erin saw was Rachel's twisted smile as the roots dragged her toward the water. "It's easier if you don't fight," Rachel whispered, her voice echoing inside Erin's head. And then, with a final, agonized scream, Erin was pulled into the darkness.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.